Now that you have completed viewing the PowerPoint presentation on the introduction of dyslexia, I want to share with you just a few highlights or a few takeaways that I'd like for you to remember as you work with your population with dyslexia. Hopefully you're following along with your teacher's manual. This manual can be found in PDF format in the Introduction and Welcome section of the course under a folder called Course Materials. You may have requested hard copies of this manual as well, which you would have received in the mail. But please follow along as you're working through each of the modules with this teacher's manual, because it covers everything that's in the PowerPoint presentation will be in your teacher's manual that you can always circle back and reference at any time. So the takeaway that I would like for you to remember when looking at dyslexia, because we're not going to delve deeply into dyslexia for the sake of this Level 1 Orton-Gillingham course, but it does behoove us to share an introduction of dyslexia and to talk just in brief about what it is and how you can best work with this population in your teaching learning venue. So one of the things that I want you to remember is a short and concise definition of dyslexia. We call this the elevator speech. So if you're in the elevator with the President of the United States and he asks you, well, what is dyslexia anyway? And you've got 30 seconds to share with him the meaning of dyslexia before he gets off. You want to be able to easily recall a quick definition of dyslexia. So the definition of dyslexia that I would like for you to remember is found in your little blue manual. You should have received this in the mail as a part of your course materials. And if you'll turn to page 1 of this manual, down midway is a definition of dyslexia that I would like for you to memorize. And we're going to change this up just a bit because years ago when Paula Rome and Jean Osman wrote this little manual, we did not have access to the technology that we have today. So today we're able to look at the brain as it's reading and see the areas of the brain that lights up when we read. So we're able to decipher and distinguish between the brain with dyslexia versus the brain without dyslexia. And so now we do know through the use of functional MRIs that dyslexia is neurologically based. So I would like for you to change or just really add the word a neurological disorder. So if you'll just add neurological there just before disorder in. And we know it's not just in children. We know that it is a disorder found in adults as well. So I would change children to individuals. So we could say a neurological disorder in individuals who, despite conventional classroom instruction, they still fail to attain those language skills of reading, writing, and spelling commensurate with their intellectual abilities. So what this means, and do you have to memorize this definition word for word verbatim? No. There are, 3 highlights that I would like for you to remember in this definition. The first highlight is that it is a neurological disorder in individuals. The second highlight is that despite conventional classroom instruction, so they're sitting in the gen ed classroom and they're just not getting it. They're not getting those language skills of reading, writing, and spelling. And then they're smart. They're of average to above average in intelligence. So those are the 3 takeaways when thinking about what dyslexia is. So it's a neurological disorder in individuals. Despite conventional classroom instruction, they're still failing to attain those language skills of reading, writing, and spelling, and they're smart. They're of average to above average in intelligence. So if you'll remember those 3 highlights, then you will easily be able to recall that elevator speech when necessary. So if you're in a parent-teacher conference or if you're in a grade level meeting and you need to, someone there asks you what dyslexia is and you need to easily recall a definition that's concise, and it's quick and easy. This is perfect for you to remember. I'm sure as you're looking back over the students in your classroom, you can think of several students that kind of encompass all of these highlights of the definition of dyslexia. I also would like for you to remember that 20% of the population has dyslexia. So that represents 1 in 5 in your classroom. So for every 5 students that you work with, one of those students has dyslexia. Of our students who qualify for special education services under the auspice of specific learning disability, 80% of those students have dyslexia. So when I think back on my years of teaching as a special education teacher, most of my students on my roster were eligible under the auspice of specific learning disability. Many school districts embrace the RTI model, and the premise behind RTI is that it minimizes the referrals to special education, because if we're providing the students what they need in tiers 2 and tier 3 of the RTI process, then it will minimize those referrals, because the students are getting what they need to be successful in a mainstream classroom. I remember attending a conference years ago at the University of Minnesota, and Dr. Doug Fuchs was the keynote speaker, and he is the grandfather of RTI, and I sat across from him at the lunch table, and he said to all of us circled around that if there's one thing that we take away from that seminar, it's that during the tiers of RTI, we really need to be using research-based strategies specific to our students' needs, and that we really can't pull worksheets off Pinterest. Now, understand, I love Pinterest. I have 5,000 pins on Pinterest. I'm a visual person. I love looking at all the pictures and saving to all of my boards. But again, we can't just randomly pull a worksheet off of Pinterest and think that that's a research-based strategy that we can use for our students in those tiers of RTI. So when we implement RTI with fidelity, we really need to be using research-based strategies specific to our students' needs in those tiers. And I say all that to say that the Orton-Gillingham approach has been the seminal approach that we've used since the 1930s as a remedial tool for those students with dyslexia. So it's really a perfect strategy to use during that tier 2 RTI intervention time. So if students aren't getting their needs met early on in the early grades, as they get older, that academic gap widens between them and their mainstream peers, and by the time they hit middle school and high school, they become discouraged. Some of them drop out. Some of them end up, engaging in criminal activity. 80% of our inmate population are dyslexic. So we want to think about that in terms of how monumental and how important it is to provide for our students early on just what they need to be successful, so that they can then go on and become successful, productive adults. So let's circle back and kind of recap what we've just talked about, some of those takeaways, some of those highlights of the Introduction to Dyslexia module of this course. So the first thing that I want you to remember is that definition of dyslexia found on page 1 of your language toolkit. Make sure you make those couple of changes. It's a neurological disorder in individuals. We know it's not just in children, it's also in adults as well. So make those couple of changes, memorize that definition so that when you are in parent-teacher conferences or data team meetings or grade level meetings, you can easily recall that definition if you need to. The second thing I'd want you to remember is about dyslexia is that it affects 20% of our population. So for every 5 students in your classroom, one of those students has dyslexia. So it is an issue that we need to address. We need to take care of this student population and best meet their academic needs. The next thing I want you to take away from this is that of those students who qualify for special education services under the auspice of specific learning disability, 80% of those students are dyslexic. So it behooves us then in that special education setting to use the Orton-Gillingham approach as that remedial tool to best accommodate the needs of that population. The next thing that I want you to think about is that a lot of school districts have embraced the RTI model. And the idea, again, the premise behind RTI is to minimize those referrals to special education. And if you have students in your gen ed classroom that are exhibiting some of those red flags, that are smart, have language-based issues, despite your instruction, they're still failing to attain those language skills of reading, writing, and spelling. In those tiers, if you used an approach like the Orton-Gillingham approach, again, this is going to minimize those referrals to special education. So it's real important that if you see those specific red flags in the classroom and they are going to tier 2 intervention, that the Orton-Gillingham approach would be an ideal approach for those students. And the last takeaway is, again, this kindergarten to prison pipeline. It's so important that we are meeting the needs of our student population in the early grades that have dyslexia, that really struggle. Despite that conventional classroom instruction, they're still not attaining those language skills of reading, writing, and spelling. They're bright. And so, again, this is why I know that you're here. You're here to learn the Orton-Gillingham approach so that you can best accommodate your student population with dyslexia. So I commend you for being here, and hopefully these takeaways are helpful. Again, we are not going to delve deeply into dyslexia for the sake of this Level 1 Orton-Gillingham course. But these takeaways are so important as you go out and work with your students with dyslexia so that you have some background knowledge as to how it manifests itself in the classroom in that teaching learning environment.